Here in the U.S., the virus has killed more than 163,000 people, by far the highest of any nation in the world. But our next guest says it is a myth that the high death toll means the U.S. was the worst at fighting the virus. Gerard Baker is editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal and columnist of Free Expression. He also hosts Wall Street Journal at Large on Fox Business Network. Jerry, good morning to you. So what is it that you're trying to say here?
Well, the larger point is that the media's coverage of the coronavirus in this country has been extraordinarily full of misrepresentations and a lot of dishonesty, to be honest. And this is perhaps the largest one, which is that it's generally been said, and the general impression is being left by the media, that the U.S. has somehow done uniquely badly handling the coronavirus. They point to 163,000 deaths, say that's the largest number in the world. But actually measured by deaths per population, I mean, as terrible as all these deaths are, of course they are, the U.S. is actually roughly in the middle of major countries in dealing with this, major countries whose numbers we can actually rely on. For example, I mean, if you take the G7 countries, United States, Japan, Italy, the UK, France, Germany, and Canada, the US is literally right in the middle there in terms of total numbers of deaths per million population. In other words, the proportion population that's died, it's doing somewhat better than most of Latin America, doing worse than Asia. Now, that's nothing to celebrate. It's not, America hasn't done particularly brilliantly, and arguably America should be doing much better given our economy and everything else that we have. But it's just not true that America has been the failure here, that this has been a uniquely American failure story. America is doing about as badly as most other countries in the world, and better than some, significantly worse than others.
Go back to the early days of the pandemic, Jerry, and you'll remember the daily press conferences that so many of the networks were taking every day from New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, calling for ventilators, added hospital capacity. And now we look back at how New York fared through this pandemic. And this is New York State death rate versus global regions deaths per 100,000. And New York tops the list. So should Governor Cuomo be taking the credit that he seems to for leading his state through this?
No, of course not. And again, this is again the media. I mean, I don't blame Governor Cuomo for trying to make a case, the best case he can for himself. But the media are to blame for helping him do it. It's just extraordinary, Sandra, for me to read every day in much of the media about what a great job New York has done flattening the curve. Exactly as you point out with those numbers there, New York State, and by the way, it's not just New York, it's the greater New York City area with New Jersey, Connecticut as well, and generally more broadly the Northeast of the United States, has among the worst outcomes for coronavirus of anywhere in the entire world, worse than large parts of Italy. Remember back in the spring, we were worried about Italy, worse than Spain, worse than the UK. And the idea that now somehow, because finally, after 5 months of lockdown, New York has managed to get mercifully get the number of cases and the number of deaths down to very low levels, while in Florida and Texas, deaths and cases are a little bit higher. The idea that is in the media is some sort of great New York success story is a complete fiction. New York has had, again, there are lots of reasons why New York, and we don't want to over-politicize it. There are many good reasons why New York had a high death toll, but I'm sure at least part of the reason was failures of political leadership in New York. And again, New York has a dramatically higher, has suffered from this much higher than all of the southern states in the United States. The Republican states that are being so hammered by the media, Florida and Texas in particular, Republican-led states, have had a much better record. And so it's just completely false to present this as a great example. And one more thing about New York. New York's economy is still flat on its back. New York's economy...
We've got the unemployment rate. Throw it up on the screen. Yeah. New York's unemployment, nearly 16% still, exactly. To Florida's just over 10, Texas at 8.6.
So the real story, Sandra, is, again, so far, and again, it's early days. Nobody should make any definitive statements about this. Things can change. But as we stand 6 months into this thing, states like Florida and Texas have managed both to keep the instance of coronavirus and the number of deaths low while maintaining a reasonable level of economic activity. New York has had and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Connecticut have had some of the highest levels of COVID in the world, some of the highest death rates in the world, and their economies have been flattened in the process. So this idea, so they haven't succeeded on either front. Florida and Texas and some of those other states have, relatively speaking, succeeded on both fronts, and yet weirdly, the media is telling us that they're the ones that have done such a bad job.
And it's not over yet. We're not out of the woods yet. So Jerry Baker, really appreciate that analysis this morning. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.